Emily, please, just one more dinner with him, that's all I'm asking for. I can't risk being seen yet, and Nathan's family loves you already. Okay, I will help you just this one last time.
The morning of the wedding, Emily Carter stood behind a door that was not her own, watching the life she was supposed to live walk away from her one heartbeat at a time. Through the narrow crack in the frame, she could see her sister's veil catching the light exactly the way hers should have. Same face, same hands, same trembling shoulders that no one else could tell apart. Only Emily knew the difference, because only Emily had spent her whole life standing one step behind it. She had 30 seconds to stop her own wedding, and she didn't move. Not because she couldn't. Because some part of her had already decided, long before that morning, that this was the only way her sister would ever get what she wanted. What Emily didn't know yet was how far that decision would carry her, or how much it would cost the man at the altar who had no idea he was about to marry the wrong woman. His name was Nathan Whitfield, and by every measure that mattered to the world watching him, he had won. Old money, a company with his family's name stamped across 3 states, a bride the papers had already started calling the perfect match for a man like him. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that the woman walking toward him down that aisle had practiced her sister's laugh in a bathroom mirror for 6 years. She had studied the way Emily tilted her head when she was nervous, the exact pause Emily left before saying yes to anything. Nathan would spend the next several months falling in love with a performance so precise that even the people who raised both women struggled to tell where one sister ended and the other began. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a bride could vanish in plain sight on her own wedding day, you have to go back to a house neither sister ever talked about. A house where 2 identical girls grew up learning 2 very different lessons about what love actually cost. One sister learned that being seen was enough. The other learned that being seen was never going to be the problem. Being chosen was. That single difference, small enough to miss at a family dinner table, would eventually put a veil on the wrong woman, and a stranger, in a dead marriage, without either of them realizing it, until it was far too late to undo. By the time the ceremony ended and the doors closed behind the newly married couple, Emily was already gone from the church, still in her sister's shadow even in her own escape. What came next would test every promise either woman had ever made to herself. Nathan would spend a year believing he understood exactly who he married. He was wrong about almost everything, and the truth, when it finally reached him, would not arrive gently. It would arrive in a kitchen, delivered by a woman he had walked past a dozen times, without once looking at her face. Because by then, Emily wasn't hiding anymore. She was working in his own house, close enough to watch the life that should have been hers unfold one dinner at a time, waiting for the moment the truth could no longer be avoided. That moment was still months away, but it was already set in motion, the way every quiet decision in this story was set in motion long before anyone involved understood what they were actually choosing. Emily and her sister were raised in the same house in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, by a mother who never quite figured out how to love 2 identical daughters as 2 separate people. Her sister's name was Claire, and from the earliest years anyone could remember, Claire was the one who got introduced first, complimented first, forgiven first. Emily was rarely cruel to her about it, and Claire was rarely kind about it either, but the imbalance settled into both of them so early that neither one questioned it anymore by the time they were teenagers. Emily became quiet, careful, the kind of girl who learned to want less so she would never have to watch herself lose. Claire became someone who believed, quietly and completely, that anything she wanted eventually belonged to her, because that had simply always been true. Their father left when the girls were 9, and their mother never fully recovered from it, financially or otherwise. Claire adapted by chasing security, with a kind of hunger most people mistook for ambition. Emily adapted by staying small, staying useful, staying out of rooms where decisions were being made about her life. By the time they reached their 20s, Claire had already dated her way through a string of men who could not keep up with what she wanted, while Emily worked quietly at a small accounting firm 2 towns over, content, or at least resigned, to a life that asked very little of her and gave back even less. Nathan Whitfield entered their lives almost by accident, through a introduction neither sister had planned for. He met Claire first, At a fundraiser their mother had talked her way into attending, and from that single conversation, Claire decided this was the opportunity she had been waiting her whole life to receive. What she didn't expect was Nathan's family, old-fashioned in a way that still mattered to men like his father, insisting on a formal introduction to the woman his son intended to marry, a meeting that would take place at their family estate weeks before any engagement was announced. Claire panicked in private for the first time anyone had seen, because 3 days before that meeting, she had made a choice in a hospital waiting room that would change absolutely everything, and it was not a choice she could take back. That choice involved a car accident on a rain-heavy road outside Cincinnati, a totaled sedan, and a diagnosis no one in the family wanted to say out loud in front of Claire. She had fractured her jaw badly enough that surgeons needed to wire it shut for recovery, and beneath the bruising and the swelling, doctors warned her face would need weeks, maybe longer, before it looked like her own again. To Claire, this was not simply an injury, it was a countdown. Nathan's family meeting was locked into place, unmovable, tied to a business trip his father was making from overseas, and Claire understood with a kind of clarity that frightened even her, that showing up bruised and unrecognizable to the most important introduction of her life was not survivable for what she wanted next. So she called the one person whose face could still stand in for hers without anyone noticing the difference. She called Emily, and she asked her sister to go in her place. Just once. Just for one dinner. Just long enough to keep the story moving until Claire could heal and step back into her own life. Emily said no the first time. She said no the second time too. But Claire had spent a lifetime learning exactly which words worked on her sister. And by the third phone call, framed as one small favor, one harmless evening, one last thing she would ever ask of her, Emily agreed. She had no way of knowing that single dinner would become the first domino in a lie that would eventually carry her all the way to the altar in her sister's place, wearing a dress that was never meant to be hers. By the time Emily left the estate that night, she told herself the favor was finished. Claire's face would heal, the introduction had gone well, and life would go back to whatever quiet shape it had before the phone rang 3 days earlier. She did not expect Nathan to call the house asking for another dinner, before Claire's jaw had even fully healed. She did not expect Claire, propped up in bed with her face still wrapped, to hand the phone back to Emily and whisper that she simply couldn't risk being seen yet, that one more dinner wouldn't hurt anything, that Nathan's family already loved her, and it would be foolish to undo that now over bad timing. Emily agreed again and again after that, each time telling herself it would be the last. What neither sister accounted for was how quickly Nathan began looking forward to those evenings, or how the version of Claire he was falling for existed only when Emily was in the room. He proposed on a Tuesday evening in early spring, in the same house where Emily had first walked through that door, and Emily stood there in her sister's dress, accepting a question that was never meant for her, unable to find a single word that could stop what was already moving faster than either sister had ever intended. Claire, healed now and fully recovered, watched the story unfold from a distance and made no move to correct it. Some part of her had already decided this arrangement suited her better than the truth ever could. Claire returned to her own life fully healed within a matter of weeks, her face exactly as it had always been, and for the first time since the accident, she allowed herself to feel triumphant instead of afraid. Nathan's proposal had already happened. The engagement was already public, and as far as anyone outside the family knew, the woman he intended to marry was simply recovering from a minor accident before returning to public life. Claire understood the arrangement had shifted into something far more valuable than she originally planned. She no longer needed to pretend she had been present for those dinners. She only needed to slide back into a role Emily had unknowingly built for her, brick by brick, one honest conversation at a time. The transition back was not seamless, though Claire made sure it looked that way to everyone but her sister. She spent hours reviewing everything Emily had told Nathan's family, memorizing details about a version of herself she had never actually presented, correcting small habits that didn't match the woman Nathan had grown attached to. Emily, meanwhile, was quietly pushed further from the process with each passing week, told her part was finished, told Nathan's family didn't need to see her again, told the wedding planning was something Claire could handle alone now that she was well enough to re-enter public life. Emily agreed to every request, the way she always had, though something in her had begun to shift the longer she watched her sister step into a life built from her own words. Nathan noticed the difference immediately, though he could not explain it in any way that made sense to him at the time. The woman he saw at cake tastings and fittings seemed sharper somehow, quicker to steer conversations, less inclined to sit quietly in a room full of opinions the way she had during those early dinners. He told himself people simply presented differently once real stress entered a relationship. He told himself the accident had changed her in ways that would take time to understand. He did not consider, even once, that the two versions of his fiancée he had experienced belonged to two entirely different women, because the idea was absurd enough that his mind refused to seriously entertain it. 3 weeks before the wedding, Emily finally asked her sister a question she had been avoiding since the night of that first dinner. She asked what happened when the marriage actually began, when daily life required a consistency Claire had never needed to maintain during a handful of curated evenings. Claire's answer was immediate and unbothered. She said Nathan loved the version of her that showed up at the altar, not the version underneath it, and that marriages required performance long after the wedding ended anyway. Emily left that conversation with a discomfort she couldn't fully name, a feeling that something about this arrangement had moved past a harmless favor into something neither of them would be able to undo once vows were spoken in front of 200 witnesses. The night before the wedding, Claire asked Emily for one final favor, framed the same careful way every request before it had been framed. She needed Emily to help her get ready in the morning, to be present in case anything went wrong, to stand close by during the parts of the ceremony where a familiar face might calm her nerves. Emily agreed without fully understanding what she was walking into, unaware that this final request would place her exactly where the story began, standing behind a door, watching her sister disappear down an aisle, in a dress that had been fitted to a body identical to her own, 30 seconds passing in silence, while a decision that would define both their lives quietly made itself. The morning of the wedding began earlier than Emily expected, with Claire waking her before sunrise and insisting they needed time alone, before the house filled with hairdressers and family members, and the noise that always seemed to follow her sister into any room. Emily arrived to find Claire already dressed halfway into the gown, staring at her own reflection with an expression Emily hadn't seen on her sister's face before, something closer to fear than the confidence she usually wore so easily. For a brief moment, Emily allowed herself to believe her sister might actually call the whole thing off, might finally admit this had gone too far to continue. Instead, Claire turned to her and asked for something Emily never expected. She asked Emily to wear the veil first, just for a few minutes, just so Claire could see how the final look would appear from a distance before the ceremony began. Emily should have refused. Looking back, she would spend months wondering why she didn't. But something about her sister's voice that morning carried a rare vulnerability, and Emily found herself standing in front of the mirror in the dress meant for someone else, veil lowered over her face, looking at a version of herself that finally matched the life she had quietly helped build for months. Claire watched from behind her, quiet for the first time in longer than Emily could remember, and then without warning, without any further conversation, she guided Emily toward a small adjoining room near the chapel entrance, telling her to wait there until she was called forward. Emily didn't fully understand what was happening until she heard the ceremony music begin on the other side of the door, and Claire's voice was nowhere near the aisle. Through the narrow crack in the doorframe, Emily watched her sister walk toward Nathan wearing an identical dress, the backup gown their mother had insisted on ordering months earlier in case of last-minute alterations, a detail Emily had forgotten entirely until that exact moment. Claire had planned this far more carefully than Emily had allowed herself to consider, using the morning's quiet request as a way to remove Emily from the equation entirely, ensuring that if anyone questioned inconsistencies later, there would be two brides dressed alike, and only one explanation anyone would accept. Emily stood frozen behind that door, 30 seconds stretching into what felt like much longer, her hand resting against the frame, fully capable of pushing it open and stopping everything unfolding in front of 200 guests who had no idea which sister was making promises that morning. She didn't move, not because she lacked the strength, but because some quiet part of her recognized that stepping forward now would not simply expose Claire, it would expose herself as well. Months of dinners and conversations, and a proposal she had unknowingly accepted on her sister's behalf. The truth, if spoken in that chapel, would ruin them both equally. So Emily stayed behind the door as vows were exchanged. As Nathan slid a ring onto Claire's finger without any indication in his expression that something had shifted from the woman he believed he was marrying. The doors closed, the music swelled, and somewhere behind a wall no guest would ever notice, the real bride stood completely alone, already understanding that whatever came next, her life was no longer entirely her own to control. In the weeks following the wedding, Emily made a decision that surprised even her mother, who had spent years assuming her quieter daughter would always choose the path of least resistance. Emily left Columbus without much explanation, telling her family only that she needed distance after everything that had happened, a statement vague enough to satisfy people who had never asked too many questions about her life to begin with. What she didn't say was that watching her sister disappear into a marriage built on Emily's own words had left her with a restlessness she couldn't settle, a need to understand what kind of life Nathan and Claire were actually building once the cameras and caterers were gone and the daily reality of marriage set in. She found work almost by accident, through a staffing agency that placed household employees with wealthy families across the state, and when a position opened at the Whitfield estate for a live-in housekeeper, Emily applied under her middle name before she had fully decided whether she would follow through with it. Nathan's household ran through a management company that handled hiring separately from the family, which meant no one involved in approving her position had any reason to connect her application to the woman whose face occasionally appeared in wedding photographs scattered throughout the house. Emily told herself this was simply curiosity, a temporary arrangement to satisfy questions she couldn't otherwise answer, though some quieter part of her understood she was placing herself deliberately close to a life that had once, briefly, felt like it belonged to her. The first time Nathan passed her in the hallway without a flicker of recognition, Emily felt something complicated settle in her chest, relief and disappointment arriving together in a way she hadn't expected. He had spent months across a dinner table from her, had proposed to a version of her he believed was permanent, and now walked past her carrying laundry without the slightest pause. It confirmed something Emily had suspected since the wedding day. Nathan had fallen in love with a collection of moments, not a face he could recognize outside the context he expected to find it in. Claire, meanwhile, adjusted to married life with the same confidence she brought to everything else, though Emily noticed early on that her sister avoided the household staff more than most new wives in her position typically did, a small detail that suggested Claire hadn't fully accounted for the possibility of being watched this closely. Weeks passed, then months, and Emily settled into a rhythm that felt uncomfortably close to normal. She cleaned rooms she once sat in as an honored guest. She overheard conversations between Nathan and Claire that revealed cracks Emily recognized immediately, moments where Claire's impatience surfaced in ways the old dinner table version of herself never would have allowed. Nathan began working later, coming home quieter, the kind of shift Emily remembered from her own parents' marriage long before it ended. She told herself she was simply observing, gathering information, protecting herself in case the truth ever surfaced, and she needed proof she hadn't acted alone in creating this situation. But some nights, folding laundry in a house that once felt briefly like her future, Emily wondered if she was waiting for something else entirely, a moment when the life she had unknowingly built for her sister might still, somehow, find its way back to her. Nathan couldn't have said exactly when the doubt started, only that it arrived gradually, the way most uncomfortable truths tend to, in small moments too minor to mention out loud but too persistent to ignore entirely. It began with a dinner conversation about a book Claire had supposedly read during their engagement, one she now claimed no memory of, dismissing the confusion as exhaustion from wedding planning. Nathan let it go easily enough the first time. But similar moments kept surfacing over the following months, gaps in memory that didn't match a woman he remembered as sharp and detail-oriented during their courtship, small preferences that seemed to have shifted without explanation, a woman who once spoke carefully and now spoke quickly, who once seemed uncertain in rooms full of his family and now moved through them with an ease that felt almost rehearsed in reverse. He mentioned it once to his mother, carefully, framing it as nothing more than the natural adjustment period every marriage required. His mother, however, had noticed something too, though she hadn't found the words for it either. She recalled the woman from those early dinners as quieter, more thoughtful, someone who listened longer than she spoke. The woman living in her son's house now carried herself differently, and while people did change, his mother admitted this felt less like growth and more like an entirely different rhythm underneath the same face. Nathan brushed the comment aside publicly, but privately, it lodged itself somewhere he couldn't quite dislodge. A splinter of doubt that grew sharper every time Claire corrected a story about their own engagement that Nathan remembered happening differently. The household staff noticed things too, though none of them said anything directly, each assuming their observations were too small to matter or too dangerous to mention to an employer. One of the housekeepers, an older woman who had worked for the family for over a decade, mentioned once to Emily in passing that the new Mrs. Whitfield seemed like an entirely different person from the woman she remembered meeting briefly before the wedding, softer then, harder now. Emily said nothing in response, though the comment stayed with her longer than she expected, confirmation that she wasn't imagining the shift, that others could sense it too even without understanding what they were actually sensing. Nathan began working longer hours, not entirely out of necessity, but because the house had started to feel unfamiliar in a way he couldn't articulate to anyone, including himself. He found himself replaying conversations from their engagement, searching for the version of his fiancée he remembered so clearly, the one who had made him believe, for the first time in years, that he could trust someone completely. That version felt increasingly distant from the woman waiting for him at dinner most nights, and though he told himself repeatedly that this was simply what marriage looked like once the excitement faded, some quieter instinct kept insisting the explanation wasn't nearly that simple. He had no idea yet how right that instinct was, or how close the truth was already standing to him, moving quietly through his own house in a housekeeper's uniform, waiting for a moment neither of them could yet predict. He asked her name out of simple courtesy, the kind of question he rarely bothered with when it came to staff, and when she answered, something about her voice caught him off guard, familiar in a way he couldn't immediately place. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, searching her face for a reason behind the strange pull he felt, before dismissing it as fatigue and heading upstairs. Emily remained in the kitchen long after he left, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter, unsettled by how easily old habits nearly gave her away, the way she had almost tilted her head the exact way she used to during those early dinners, the mannerism Claire had never quite managed to replicate herself. Over the following weeks, small interactions accumulated between them, each one seemingly meaningless on its own. Nathan began finding reasons to be in the kitchen when he knew she would be there, telling himself it was simply easier to discuss household matters directly, rather than through the management company. Emily told herself she was only being professional, though she found herself lingering in rooms a few minutes longer than her duties required whenever she heard his footsteps approaching. Neither of them acknowledged what was happening, both too committed to their own carefully maintained explanations to consider the alternative sitting quietly in front of them. It was a conversation about something entirely unrelated, a stray comment about a restaurant downtown, that finally cracked the surface neither of them had been willing to examine. Emily mentioned a small detail about the restaurant's corner booth, a detail only someone who had actually sat there with him would know, and Nathan felt the floor shift slightly beneath him, a fact that made no logical sense standing next to a woman he had only just met months earlier. He didn't say anything in that moment, but he found himself staring at her a beat too long, searching her face with an intensity that made Emily's chest tighten with something dangerously close to hope. Neither of them spoke, the thought forming between them, but for the first time since the wedding, the truth had quietly entered the room and refused to leave. That night, Nathan didn't say anything to Claire about the comment, but he also didn't sleep, lying awake replaying the exact tone of the housekeeper's voice, the specific details of a restaurant booth he had never once mentioned to anyone outside those early engagement dinners. He told himself there had to be a simple explanation, that Claire might have described the restaurant to staff at some point, that coincidence explained more strange moments in life than people liked to admit. But the explanation felt thin even as he constructed it, and by morning, a quiet decision had formed in him that he wasn't ready to say out loud to anyone, least of all his wife. He started paying closer attention, not just to Claire, but to the small physical details he had never bothered documenting before, the shape of a signature, the particular scar near her left wrist he remembered asking about once during their engagement. When he casually asked Claire about that scar over breakfast one morning, framing it as idle curiosity, she hesitated a half-second too long before answering, offering an explanation that didn't quite match what he remembered her telling him months earlier. It was a small inconsistency, the kind reasonable people forgot about their own bodies all the time, But Nathan no longer had the luxury of dismissing small inconsistencies. He had accumulated too many of them by now to call any single one an accident. He hired a private investigator quietly, through a contact unrelated to his family's usual circle, requesting something vague enough to avoid suspicion, background verification on his own wife, framed as routine due diligence related to a business trust his father insisted on updating. The investigator returned within 2 weeks with information that unsettled Nathan more than he expected. Confirmation of a sister, a woman named Emily, who shared an unusually close resemblance to Claire, and who had, according to public records, worked briefly at an accounting firm before seemingly vanishing from any traceable employment history, around the same time Nathan's engagement became public. Nathan sat with that information for several days before doing anything with it, turning it over from every possible angle, trying to construct an explanation that didn't lead where the facts were clearly pointing. He thought about the housekeeper in his kitchen, the familiarity in her voice, the restaurant details she shouldn't have known, and slowly, uncomfortably, the pieces began arranging themselves into a shape he wasn't prepared to fully accept yet. He needed to see her again, needed to ask a question directly and watch her face when she answered it, because some part of him already understood that the truth waiting for him in his own house was far larger than a scar or a forgotten book. And once he asked the question out loud, there would be no quiet way to put the truth back where he found it. He found her in the small laundry room off the east wing on a Thursday afternoon, sunlight cutting through the single window in a way that made the moment feel less like an accident and more like something the house itself had arranged. Emily heard him enter and turned instinctively, the same practiced composure she had maintained for months, settling over her expression before she had time to think about it. Nathan closed the door behind him, a small gesture that told her immediately this conversation wasn't going to be about household matters. And for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the silence between them heavier than any accusation could have been. He asked her plainly whether her name was actually Emily Carter, and whether she had a sister named Claire. He watched her face as he asked it, searching for the flicker of confusion an innocent person would show, the kind of blank denial that comes naturally to someone with nothing to hide. Instead, Emily's shoulders dropped slightly, not in shock, but in something closer to exhaustion, the particular relief of a lie finally reaching its ending point after being carried alone for far too long. She didn't deny it. She simply asked him how much he already knew, and in that question alone, Nathan understood that everything he suspected was true, and that the woman standing in front of him now was the same woman who had sat across from him during every dinner that convinced him he wanted to marry her. What followed wasn't the explosive confrontation either of them might have expected months earlier, when the truth still felt like something that could be shouted across a room. Instead, Emily told him everything quietly, methodically, starting with the accident, and the wired jaw, and the single favor that was never supposed to extend past one dinner. She told him about the proposal she never intended to accept on her sister's behalf, about the morning of the wedding and the veil, and the 30 seconds she had spent frozen behind a door, while her sister walked toward him instead. Nathan listened without interrupting once, his expression shifting slowly from disbelief to something far more complicated, the recognition that the version of his engagement he remembered so fondly had, in fact, actually happened, just not with the woman he had ultimately married. When Emily finished speaking, Nathan sat down slowly on an overturned laundry basket, the absurdity of the moment not lost on either of them despite its weight, and asked the only question that mattered now. He asked her why, after everything, she had stayed close enough to watch this unfold, instead of disappearing entirely and letting the lie exist without her. Emily didn't have a clean answer for him, only the truth, admitting that some part of her had never fully accepted that the life built from her own words belonged to someone else, and that watching him from a distance had been easier than losing him completely a second time. The silence that followed carried an entirely different weight than the one before it, heavy not with suspicion now, but with the uncomfortable possibility neither of them had allowed themselves to name out loud until this exact moment. When the denial finally broke, what replaced it wasn't remorse so much as irritation, a frustration that the plan she had managed successfully for over a year had unraveled because of a restaurant booth and a scar Nathan happened to remember too clearly. She defended herself the only way she knew how, insisting that Nathan had married the version of her he actually wanted, that the accident had simply accelerated something that would have worked out fine if left alone. That Emily had gone along with every step of it willingly, and had no right to feel wronged by an arrangement she participated in herself. Nathan listened to all of it with a stillness that unsettled Claire more than anger would have, because somewhere in that stillness, she understood she had already lost whatever version of him she had spent the last year convincing herself she'd won. The days that followed moved quickly once the truth was finally spoken aloud in that house. Nathan's family, informed carefully and privately before any public version of events could take shape, reacted with the kind of controlled fury only people protecting a name and a fortune could produce, more concerned initially with managing exposure than processing the emotional wreckage underneath it. Legal conversations began almost immediately, an annulment moving forward on grounds few lawyers had likely encountered in quite this specific form, the marriage dissolving nearly as quickly as it had been built, leaving behind a settlement negotiation far more interested in silence than in fairness. Claire left the estate within the week, her belongings packed by staff who had once answered to her, her name already fading from a story that would soon belong to someone else entirely. She would spend months afterward insisting to anyone who asked that she had simply loved a life more than she'd ever loved the man attached to it, a distinction she seemed to believe excused everything that came before it. Nathan, meanwhile, remained in a house that suddenly felt too large and too quiet, surrounded by reminders of a marriage that had technically never existed, forced to sit with the uncomfortable realization that the only honest relationship he'd built in that entire year had happened with a woman he wasn't even supposed to know. A year later, in a small ceremony that looked nothing like the elaborate wedding that had started this entire story, Nathan and Emily were married in front of a handful of people who actually knew both of them honestly. There was no veil switched behind a door, no sister waiting in the wings, no 30 seconds of silence deciding the outcome of anyone's life. Just two people who had found their way to each other through a lie neither of them created, choosing this time, deliberately and without hesitation, to build something real. Whether justice was ever truly served for what Claire had done remained a question neither of them could fully answer. But watching Nathan and Emily rebuild something honest from the wreckage of that first year offered its own quiet kind of resolution, the kind that doesn't erase what happened, but refuses to be defined by it either.